Welcome to the Pharma Podcast, conversations with industry experts and business leaders about important and current topics in Canadian pharma, biotech, and medtech. I'm your host, Sam Tarantino. My guest today is Ryan Clarke, founder of Advocacy Solutions and senior partner at Accelera Canada, where he is responsible for advocacy and stakeholder relations. Ryan will discuss CADTH and the Streamlined Patient and Clinician Input Processes to CADTH. Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sam. Great to be here.
So Ryan, for our audience, tell us a little bit about yourself and Advocacy Solutions.
Sure. Sam, Advocacy Solutions was started almost 18 years ago, and it's a business that is committed to teaching and training people how to be effective advocates on their own behalf. My background is law, government. I worked in the government of Ontario for a period of time. I also worked in the pharmaceutical industry, and then, as I said, started this business, which really is focused on empowering patients, caregivers, and clinicians to advocate typically to government and typically in support of publicly funded access to medications here in Canada.
Tell us a little bit about the HTA process and CADTH.
Sure, absolutely. So CADTH, as you know, stands for the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. It is Canada's health technology assessment body, national body. As you also know, there's a parallel HTA process in Quebec, which I won't touch on today. But CADTH is really responsible for conducting an evaluation of the clinical, economic, patient, and clinician evidence on drugs, and uses these evaluations to provide reimbursement recommendations to the federal, provincial, and territorial public drug plans. This all occurs after Health Canada has approved a medication for sale in this country.
What role? So Ryan, what role does a manufacturer play in the HTA process in Canada?
So the manufacturers are what are called sponsors. That's the term that's used, and there are actually three different sponsors who can submit to CADTH. Submit in the sense of saying that they would like a medication reviewed for consideration of public reimbursement. So first of all, there are industry sponsors, so pharmaceutical companies. They're typically the DIN holders for the drug being filed. Also, drug programs. So one of the public drug programs, Sam, we have 19 public drug programs in Canada. So one of those public drug programs can also submit to CADTH and request that a medication be reviewed. And then on the oncology side, tumor groups in Canada can also submit to CADTH requesting that a particular medication be considered for review.
I understand that stakeholders, patients, and clinicians can provide input when a drug is being reviewed by CADTH. Tell us about the history of those processes.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So they are two separate processes. The first one, patient input, was introduced at CADTH in April of 2011. And that process initially provided patient groups, not individual patients or caregivers initially, but just patient groups, the opportunity to provide input into the CADTH review process of a particular drug, both in oncology and non-oncology filings, by filling out a template. They had one for oncology drugs and then a different one for non-oncology products, consisting of a series of what we refer to, Sam, as prompting questions. Input was provided prior to commencement of the review, and oncology patient groups actually had to register with CADTH to have their input accepted. Non-oncology groups didn't have to register, but oncology groups did have to register. And then around 2016, a couple of changes came into effect. For the first time, individual patients and caregivers could provide input where no patient group existed. And secondly, on the oncology side, known as PCODR, the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, patient groups were given a second chance to provide input. It's actually called feedback after CADTH issued an initial recommendation on a drug review. So that's kind of a bit of the history on the patient group side. On the clinician side, that opportunity first arose, formal opportunity first arose in February of 2016. And clinicians only on the oncology side initially were permitted to provide input, and only physicians, even though they used the term clinicians, it was only physicians, could provide input when it first opened back then. It provided individual physicians or groups of physicians. And when I say groups, by the way, it could be a formal group, it could be an informal group, the opportunity to provide input into the CADTH review process of a particular cancer drug, again, like on the patient side, by filling out a template consisting of a comparable series of prompting questions. That input was provided prior to the commencement of the review, and feedback was provided after the issuance of an initial recommendation. So again, clinicians had two opportunities to comment. Initially, when the review was undertaken, and then after the first recommendation, or what's called the initial recommendation, was made by CADTH. And importantly, physicians had to register with CADTH in order to be have their input considered. And then finally, in 2018, the definition of clinician was expanded to include oncology pharmacists and oncology nurses.
So it sounds like there have been some significant changes in the way patient groups and clinician groups now provide input to CADTH. Can you tell us more about these new streamlined processes?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So what I just went through with you was kind of a history that brought us up to about middle of last year, or sort of the fall of last year. And then in September and October of 2020, CADTH significantly streamlined both the oncology and the non-oncology input processes for patients and clinicians. So I'll hit just some of the highlights, Sam, of sort of some of the new pieces, and then we can sort of dig into it a bit more. Number one, there's now a single patient input template for both oncology and non-oncology reviews. So there's not one template for patients in cancer and one in non-cancer. It's now one single template. Secondly, there's an opportunity for patient groups to provide both upfront input and feedback to an initial recommendation for both oncology and non-oncology reviews. You'll recall that patients used to be able to provide 2 moments of input in oncology, but not in non-oncology. Now they can provide it across both. Patient groups don't have to register anymore, and individual patient input is still allowed when there is no applicable patient group here in Canada. On the clinician side, submissions can now be made by clinicians in the non-oncology space. And Sam, this is probably the most significant change in the reforms from late last year. Clinicians can now provide input in the non-oncology space, again using a common template, but they must be done, these submissions, they must be done by groups or associations of healthcare professionals. Individual clinician submissions will now only be accepted when there is no relevant group or association. And that's really, for me, a fascinating change, because when the clinician input process was founded back in February 2016, it was very much founded on the premise that individual clinicians would provide individual submissions. That has turned 180 degrees. Now, CADTH really wants clinicians to come together either as formal or informal groups to provide submission. Again, all submissions by clinicians will have an opportunity to provide input both upfront as well as feedback to an initial recommendation. And finally, there's no longer a registration requirement for individual physicians who want to participate or anyone else. So no more registration requirement is in effect at CADTH.
Can you tell us why you think it's important for patient groups and clinician groups to take advantage of these input opportunities?
Well, I do think it's important because it really does represent an opportunity for greater transparency and greater input. We know, for example, that CADTH very much encourages this kind of input. Their own materials reflect the fact that on the patient group side, for example, they believe that the patient perspective improves the quality of the reimbursement reviews, and I would have to agree with that. It really helps the experts who are deliberating to better understand, and this is in the CADTH material, Sam, to better understand the nature of the disease, to identify the health outcomes that are particularly of importance to patients. They also want to understand the diversity of needs amongst patients. And that's important, and including subpopulations here in Canada. And then they also want to identify potential issues around patients' abilities to use and access the drugs under review. So we really think it's important. I think it's important, and I believe that CADTH does too in their stated materials, that when you have patients, and I should say, by the way, it's not just patients, it's also caregivers. When you have patients and caregivers engaged in this exercise, then it really does add to the transparency, accountability, and credibility of the recommendations being made.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Sam, that's on the patient side. On the physician side, it's comparable. I think that, again, CADTH wants to hear from clinicians. They want to. I think it provides greater legitimacy, just like when patients provide input or patient groups provide input, provides greater legitimacy when you have clinicians providing input into this process. And so that's why I believe fundamentally that CADTH has opened up the opportunity now for all clinicians in oncology and non-oncology to provide that input.
So, based on your experience, what makes a good patient group input submission, and the same question for what makes a good clinician group input submission?
So, on the patient group side, the CADTH has done a good job of providing a guidance document that's available on their website that sort of more or less answers this question. But based on my experience, I think it all starts with the input. So CADTH encourages patient groups to go out and get input from patients and caregivers. So it's a patient group from their members or supporters or whoever these people are. So we often recommend starting with a survey. It can be an online survey in which you ask your, again, supporters a series of questions. Those questions should reflect the content that is specifically being requested in the template that the patient group needs to fill out to submit to CADTH. And that's relatively straightforward in terms of what can be done. Second way that they can be really done in a robust manner is through patient interviews, often telephone interviews. And those telephone interviews, Sam, often focus on patients specifically who have experience with the drug that's under review. Let's say the medication's been available in Canada through a compassionate program or more likely through a clinical trial or something like that. Then a telephone interview can be very effective. An important thing to note here, too, is that patient groups are allowed to solicit input from patients who live outside of Canada. And in fact, patient groups from outside of Canada are allowed to make submissions to CADTH. Mm-hmm. And the reason why it's broad like that is because CADTH wants to hear from patients who've had experience with the drug under review, and oftentimes will be in a situation where the drug under review has never been used by any Canadians. There was never a clinical trial here, for example, or something like that. So they allow a tremendous amount of leeway for patients to go out internationally and look for individuals who have experience with the medication and be able to provide that input as well. So it starts with sort of the content that you have that to work with as a patient organization. Once you have that content, then I think the next key to a good submission is one that is well written, and maybe that goes without saying. But the more succinct, the more focused, and in some ways, the more repetitive, the better. In other words, we suggest that patient groups consider having some key messages, if you will, that sort of resonate throughout their submission, and that make it very, very clear what the patient group's position is on the content that is being requested by CADTH, the information that's being requested by CADTH. So, and we know that CADTH appreciates information that is succinct and is focused. Quotes are something that CADTH also encourages, actual quotes from patients and caregivers that can be incorporated. They don't want piles of them, but certainly having some quotes in there can be very effective and very much appreciated. So that's on the patient side. Let's flip over now to the clinician side. Sam, on the clinician side, the key there, I think, is really to ensure that as many clinicians in a therapeutic area, or clinicians that treat that particular disease, or that use or have had experience with a particular drug under review, provide input. Again, often through a survey process, not so much interviews, but definitely through a survey process. So in a rare disease, for example, where you might have a very, very small or a very, very finite group of clinicians who treat this disease, let's say there's 12 of them in Canada, which is not unrealistic in some circumstances. A good submission by a clinician group would try to get all 12 or as many of those clinicians as possible to provide input and to sign on to that particular submission. And then that would send a very clear message, for example, to CADTH that this community thinks this medication is important enough to provide commentary on, and that they are somewhat united, presumably, in what it is that they have to say about it. So on the clinician side, in addition to all the stuff I talked about on the patient side, surveys, well-written quotes, that kind of thing, I think it's important that you have as good a representation from the clinician community, particularly the prescribing clinician community, as possible to ensure a really good and robust submission by those clinicians.
So after CADTH issues a final recommendation around whether a drug should be publicly funded or not, is there a process for patient groups, clinician groups, to continue to be engaged?
There sure is, but that's likely a whole other podcast, Sam. But yes, there definitely is. It does not end with the CADTH review process. But
we'll have you on again.
Absolutely. Love to.
So
Love to.
One final thought: these streamlined processes, are they good? Are they good for patients or patient groups?
I think they are. I think they're good for patient groups, and I think they're good for clinicians. You can tell a little bit from the history that I shared with you earlier on that when CADTH initially started as the HTA body in Canada, there was no opportunity for patients, caregivers, clinicians to provide input. Then they moved into allowing patient groups to do so, and then clinicians, and now they've really sort of completed, in my opinion, to some extent, the pool around input. So all patient groups now, oncology, non-oncology, it's been that way for a while, but now all clinicians in oncology, non-oncology, and clinicians is a relatively robust group. So I think the more input that is requested from people like patients and caregivers and clinicians, the more opportunity there is for input. Remember, there's not just input when the submission goes in, but there's input now on the initial recommendation by CADTH, so 2 points of input. That's an expansion. Really does represent progress. I see this as a pathway to greater transparency, a pathway to greater input, which I believe is a good thing for us as Canadians, because this is our HTA body. We're all impacted by the recommendations that are made here. And so I see us having made a lot of progress, and now we will continue, I hope, to make it even more transparent moving into the future.
Brian, thank you. Thank you for your time. How can the audience connect with you?
Well, probably the easiest way to connect with me would be to send me an email. My email, I have a couple of email addresses. I can be reached at Ryan@Advocacy Solutions, that's solutions with an S.ca. And of course, I can also be reached through my email address at Accelera Canada. That is Ryan.Clarke, that's Clarke with an E, at Accelera Canada, all one word, .com.
Contact details for Ryan are also available on our website at thepharmapodcast.ca. Thank you for listening. This podcast can be found on our website at thepharmapodcast.ca. The Pharma Podcast is also available to listen to for free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. Thank you to our sound engineer, Errol Francis. Please subscribe and follow me on LinkedIn to stay up to date on future podcasts. If you would like to be a guest on this podcast, or if there is a topic we should cover in future episodes, please connect with me via LinkedIn.